Do you love reading novels that are rich in details? I know that I do. And today I want to talk about adding details or historical details to stories and why that is so important.
You have a story to tell, but you don't know where to start. Let me show you how to free your story. I teach you how to write and how to dig deep in your soul to release your story and make a difference in the world.
Welcome to the Julia Amante channel. If we're just meeting, I am Julia Amante, and I am a women's fiction author here on Fridays to give you some writing tips. So today the writing tips that I'm going to give you or talk to you about are adding historical details to your story. Now, as I mention always, I'm a women's fiction author. I write contemporary stories. I don't write historical novels typically. And so one of the reasons that I don't is because I didn't want to have to really mess with the whole historical details, right? I didn't want to have to do tons of research and make sure that I get everything correct, because you have to. If you're writing about something in the 1800s, you have to make sure that you're not including things that didn't exist back then, or that characters are not behaving in ways that wouldn't have been normal back in that time period, right? So when we're writing historical novels, when we're writing historical stories, we want to be as accurate as possible. We want to be correct. And so that means that it requires a lot of research in order to make sure that it is correct, make sure that the author really understands what they're writing about before, of course, they start to write the story. So I thought, I do like reading historical novels, but I'm not going to ever write one because I don't want to have to deal with all that. I don't want to accidentally get something wrong and then, have readers that are disappointed. And, I just thought, I'm very safe with contemporary stories. I also like contemporary stories and I find them easier to write. But for the first time, I'm writing not a true historical. I'm writing a story, or I've written a story that takes place over 3 decades, starting in the 1960s and moving into the 1990s. So uh, I was born in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, but obviously, I didn't, when you're a baby, you don't know anything. So I feel like I really didn't live in the 60s, right? And I was a little kid in the early 70s. So I needed to do a lot of research. I needed to know things like, for example, if the character is buying a car, which he does do in the novel, what kind of car would he buy? And what kind of car could someone making his income afford? And, all those little things that I think are important to bring authenticity to the novel and to have, again, the reader not say, to actually feel like they're in that setting rather than saying, oh, wow, she doesn't know what she's talking about. This is not the type of car that existed back then. Or, if you say that they drove a certain brand that didn't even exist, of course, that's not going to be good. So you want to get all that accurate. So let's talk then today about adding those historical details. Whether you're a historical writer or whether you're a contemporary writer, at some point you're going to need to add something from the past. Maybe the character's just remembering something from their childhood, or even a contemporary novel. You're going to sometimes want to add something from the past, or maybe they're visiting a location and they want to, well, wow, this city was founded in what year, and you want to add that to your novel. So no matter what type of writer you are, you really do need to sometimes add some historical details in. So we're going to talk about how to do that correctly. So we're going to talk about 2 ways that we can do that. How we're going to add those details, those historical details to our story. So first is to provide a background to the main story. So it's not part of the main story, but it adds to that background and it makes you understand the time that the characters live, the way that they live, what were the customs, what was the culture like. So those kind of things are important because they give us a feel for the story. So I'm going to give you an example of one of my favorite writers. So when I first started writing, and I started writing romance novels, and I would read tons of romance novels, and one of my favorite authors still is Laverne Spencer. And the book that, and I'm going to read just a little section of it, so I won't bore you with a big part, but just to show you, give you an example. So it was a book called Twice Loved, and it was about a man who comes back, and it's gosh, I think it was in the it was 1830s, and her husband comes back from he was some type of fisherman, and he come anyways. They thought he was lost at sea, and all of a sudden he comes back. And when he comes back, she was supposed to marry him. She ends up, because he's gone, marrying his best friend. So problem, right? Here he comes. I don't know if he was married originally, or if he was just going to get married. But anyhow, he thinks this is, this was my fiance. This was my wife. And now she's married to somebody else. So there's this love triangle. The woman feels, of course, she's excited and happy that this man is alive that she loved. And but then now she feels guilty because she's married to somebody else, but she also feels an obligation, of course, to her husband that she's married to. So it's this very kind of craziness. So Ry comes back and he's talking to his father about, the injustice of this whole thing. And so he says, the law can free her just as it tied her to him. Josiah, who was his father's scowl, nearly hid his blue-gray eyes beneath his grizzled brow. Divorce? Ry pierced his father with a look of determination. Aye, it is what I'm thinking. On Nantucket? The two words needed no further embellishment. The rigid puritanical beliefs of Nantucket's forefathers still clung. In his whole life, Ry had never heard of any couple from the island divorcing. Okay, so that's a historical fact, detail that sets a nice little scene, right? It lets us know that, first of all, what are the expectations of the time, what's accepted, what's not accepted, how is the culture, how is the society going to look at this if this woman gets divorced? How are they going to treat her? And just by the father's shock and the father's response to him, like, really, here, you think she can get divorced? It gives us some details about the time without having to like go on and on and on, because that's all that they talk about. Then they go on to talk about something else, which I'll share in a second. But it's enough, right? It's enough to give us a feeling. It's not like, so when I'm talking about the details, I'm not saying just like flowery language or a bunch of adjectives or anything like that. This is an amazing detail, and it tells us a lot. They don't have to say anymore, but it gives us a detail about what it was like to live in Nantucket in the early 1800s. Okay. Another thing that we tend to learn sort of along the same lines is just physically what it's like. So they start talking about other things, right? And they're chopping wood or doing things, getting wood together. And it says, with no source of wood on Nantucket, Josiah got his rough-ribbed staves from the mainland farmers, whose wood supply was limitless and whose land would otherwise have been idle during the long winter. Each spring, a full year's supply of dimensional boards was delivered in exchange for finishing barrels and pails, and the arrangement benefiting both the farmer and the cooper. Okay, so again, this is more detailed, right? This is just tells us like, okay, what did they do? How did they get their wood supply? All of that, right? And it helps us, again, just to kind of understand what it is these people are doing, how they're living, how they're getting their wood, how they're getting their barrels, and what they're doing, how they exchange, how the exchange benefits both of them. So all of this is background stuff, right? It tells us about the culture, it tells us about how they lived, it tells us all that stuff. It's not actual plot, although it is, right? It's always about the plot too and the characters, but it gives us a background. So that's one way that you can use details to add to your story, just so that the reader understands where they're at, where the characters are at, and of course where the reader is at, because the reader is reading that. So first way, background, just providing background. Second is providing facts that will support your story. So the example I gave you of the car, right? So those are facts that will support the story, because again, what kind of car does this character need to have, and it depends on what period of time you're writing about. So in the United States, early on, people drove a lot of Fords. Why? Because they were the first cars that were mass produced in the United States, so that people could buy cars, right? So that they could drive cars. Then that would make sense that people would, that's what they would have. They would have a Ford because that's what people drove. But you're using it even more just to support the story. So why does the character have this, why does this character need this car? Why does this character buy a car? It supports the story and moves the story forward. So you use the facts that are important that help you to understand and move your story forward. So in Let Us Begin, my novel that I'm mentioning, I did use some historical facts. So I mentioned the Robert F. Kennedy's assassination. Okay, why did I do that? Well, first of all, it happened during the time period where the characters are living. But there's a lot of things that happened that I didn't mention, right? So I mentioned the specific fact because it impacted the story. One of the reasons this character immigrated to the United States was because he was inspired by John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. And so he had affection, he had a great affection for the Kennedy family. And so this impacted him, right? During the same time, we have Neil Armstrong's landing on the moon. That was huge, right? But I didn't include that. Why? And I thought about it. I'm like, I should include it because it kind of sets the time period, so for the background that I was talking about in the previous reason that you should include facts, right, is to give us a feel for the time. But I thought I've already done that enough so that people do have a feel for the time. So I don't need to do that again. And it's really not relevant to my book or the story. So even though it was a huge thing, right? The moon landing was huge and it was a historical fact, I decided not to include it, but I did include Robert Kennedy's assassination because this impacted my character and the way he felt about the Kennedy, the way it hurt him, right, personally, and the way that it changes the way his dreams of living in the United States. So John F. Kennedy was assassinated. His brother gets assassinated. In a way, it's a metaphor for how his life is going. His dream is getting to a point where it can get assassinated, right? He's losing that dream that sort of America is losing at the time too, right? Because the 60s were a very wild time where there was a lot going on. So that's why I included that fact, and that's why you want to choose your facts so that they are supporting your story or they're providing background to your story. Pausing for a second to let you know about a couple of courses that I've created. If you're a beginning writer and you want some help with your book, I just want to let you know that I do have a basic course on how to write, and I'm going to post it below. And if you're not a beginning writer, but you are more established and you're ready to publish your work, you have your novel written, I also have a publishing course. And I will also post it below, so take a look at it. Maybe they'll be just what you're looking for. All right, let's go back to the video now. Okay, what about as far as accents or language? Do you want to add those details? So if somebody has an accent, Irish accent, whatever, right? Do you want to include that that diction or that language into your story? Yes or no. So maybe. Let's put it that way. If you have a good handle for that, then you want to include it because it does give it some flavor, but not a lot. Okay, just a little bit, because you don't want to, you don't want to write like old English, right? Because nobody would understand what it is that you're trying to say. So you can choose some. I sometimes add some Spanish into my novels because it gives it, again, some flavor. And some just, some historical feel for the time and for some cultural feel for the time. So sometimes I'll add that in there, but I don't overdo it. Otherwise, first of all, it would confuse maybe some people. And you know when and it's too much. You don't want to add too much. You just want to add some so they understand that maybe this character speaks a different language or has a different accent. But it's up to you, really. You don't really have to do that if you don't want to. Okay, another piece of advice with adding details is, or historical details, is that you can be kind of creative with history, not change history or lie about history. So that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying though is, let's say that your character in your novel meets a historical figure. Well, that's kind of cool because readers do like, and it has to be possible, right? So they have to be in a position where they would actually meet a historical figure. You can't have, like you could, I guess, you could have like an average person that runs into a president or something, right? But I mean, if they're really having an interaction, they're really going out to dinner, they're at a dinner party together. Your character has to be the type of person in that social circle that would meet this person, right? So, or have a relationship with that person. But if they are, let's assume, assuming that they are, that they can connect with them, then it's kind of cool to have your character be with a historical person. The only thing you want to make sure is be as accurate as possible, even though it's not true, right? So let's say that your character is meeting with Benjamin Franklin. Make sure Benjamin Franklin was actually in that city that time. You know, he wasn't in France when you're saying he was in the United States. So just research that, and then from there you can be a little creative. You can have conversations that they didn't have. You can have your character interact. You can also have your character be at historical events. You know, the Forrest Gump movie where he's in all these different historical events, right? Is kind of cool. So he didn't, and he does meet different people, right? I think he gets some kind of Congressional Medal of Honor or something from the president. He does all kinds of stuff in that movie, right? So things like that, you're welcome to do. You can be creative with historical events and with people, historical people. Just make it seem possible, plausible. Okay, how about being sensitive to today's time? So there are some horrible things that have happened in history, and do we want to change it or modify it so that we're sensitive? Okay, I don't believe so. I don't want to change history. I like, for example, we mentioned Laverne Spencer and that the character could not get married, right? Oh, there have been very male-dominated time periods in our country where women couldn't do certain things. I mean, and it wasn't that long ago. I know that, like, my mother-in-law, she couldn't open a bank account by herself without her husband's approval. I know my mom couldn't take us out of the country. Like, she couldn't fly with us. Back and forth to Argentina unless she had my father's permission, which I think now is both parents. I don't know. I honestly don't even know what the rules are anymore. But he didn't. He could have taken us whenever he wanted, but she had to get his permission in order to be able to fly with her children internationally. So you don't want to change that. Yeah, it might seem like, oh, that seems so sexist, right? Or that seems so offensive. But that's what it was like then. So I like being true to what history was like. So my recommendation is be accurate, be accurate to what it was like. You could say things like, it's like, it seems unfair, like even people within a certain time period are more advanced, right? Or see things differently. There were people during the time of slavery that knew slavery was wrong, right? So what you could do is have like maybe some other character, or even your own character, mention maybe that, that this is wrong. I wonder when we're going to be able to change this, or something, right? Something that shows sort of our modern thoughts and in the time period before it existed. So, but I think you want to be as accurate as possible for a couple of reasons. First of all, history is history, and I want to be accurate. And the second thing is, if you're not accurate, if you're writing something that just wasn't true, there are going to be readers out there that are going to go, well, wait a minute, that actually isn't true. A woman couldn't do that back then. A woman wasn't, they know their history and they're like, no way, that's not true. And what is the reader going to think? The reader isn't going to think that you're being sensitive to today's time. What the reader's going to think is, you didn't do your research, you don't know what you're talking about, and you're going to lose credibility as a writer. So my recommendation is, if you're writing historical detail, cultural type things, just be accurate with what happened, okay? Okay, what if something really did happen, but there's some controversy about it, or there's, conspiracy theories? What do you do? How do you write that? Okay, my recommendation again is to write the accepted truth, okay? So there's a lot of people keep talking about John F. Kennedy, right? So John F. Kennedy, there's a lot of people that believe that John F. Kennedy was killed, murdered by our own government, right? That it wasn't just this lone guy who shot him. People believe that. It could be true. It could be a conspiracy theory. But what is the accepted history? That's what you should go with, okay? Because again, it's what the accepted history is. You don't want to write, you can always say that unless you're writing that kind of novel, right? So you could always say somebody else believes something differently. You could say that, right? Even your character could believe something differently. Like, I don't believe that's possible. There were people even during that time, not many though. Most people trusted the government and said, no, it was what it was, right? They say that, Lee Harvey Oswald was the one shooter that shot him, and then that was it. But there were people during that time that were like, wait a minute, I don't think that happened, or I heard multiple shots, or, right? There were other people that were like, no, something is not up here. But most people during that time really trusted what was told to them, and they accepted it. And so that's what you want to go with. Especially if you're writing about the history of that time period, then that's what most people would have believed. Now, unless you're writing an alternate type of history, which Stephen King did with his book, that was, well, it was 11/22/63. That was the title of his book. But anyways, he wrote about a guy who goes back in time, if you haven't read that book, and changes history. He tries to save Kennedy, and all kinds of crazy stuff happens because, of course, he changes a lot of things, and he ends up having to go multiple times back and forth to try to fix what he messed up, and these time travel type of books. So that was an alternate history. So there, anything's possible. You can put whatever you want. But I mean, if you're writing just, about your character's grandfather who lived during that time, he probably would have believed, most likely, the history. So most of the time you just want to go with accepted history rather than tangent type theories that only a few people might believe. So hopefully this gives you just some ways to think about how to add historical details. The most important thing really is your story though, right? Your story is what matters. You're using these historical details and facts and culture, all of that, just to help your story, to make your story stronger, to make your story more believable, to make your readers feel like they're really being placed in that time period, and that your story feels authentic to them. But the important part is your story. Whatever feels good and real to your story is what you should do, keeping your facts as factual and real as possible. Okay, so I hope that helps you. And if it does, please hit that like button and share it with any friends that might be interested in learning a little bit more about writing. And hit that notification bell so that you will be notified next week when the next video is up. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next week.